Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey. Being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 38 of my historical travel podcast Voyage to Go History, where I take you on some of the most daring journeys from the past, expeditions that still shape how we see the world today. In the true story I'm telling, 17-year-old German Georg Forster sails around the world with his father, a naturalist, in the 18th century aboard the HMS Resolution under Captain James Cook. Georg's account is written in the style of his time, so I have translated it into modern English. His knowledge reflects the late 18th century, and along the way, I'll step in to provide historical context and additional background. What happened in the last episode?
After months adrift in the vast South Pacific, the crew of the Resolution finally sighted land, Easter Island, a place long shrouded in mystery. The first glimpse of the coast offered little promise. Barren hills, sparse vegetation, and strange black stone figures rising from the earth. Yet the sight alone brought renewed hope to the weary sailors. Initial contact with the islanders was peaceful. Two men paddled out in a small, carefully crafted canoe and offered ripe bananas, an almost sacred gift to those starved of fresh produce. The following day, a small group, including Georg Forster, went ashore. Though he could barely walk due to swelling in his legs, the encounter with the islanders and the land itself had a healing effect. The locals were cautious but curious, speaking a dialect similar to Tahitian and offering modest goods like sweet potatoes, sugarcane, and cooked chickens. Inland, the landing party explored rudimentary dwellings, sparse plantations, and intricately laid stone platforms supporting towering statues. These moai, though crudely carved, revealed a culture both distinct and yet deeply connected to the wider Polynesian world. The episode ended with the crew's tentative steps further inland, facing the island's poverty, its people's dignity, and the mysteries carved in volcanic stone.
Tuesday, March 15th, 1774, Easter Island, Rapa Nui.
Early the next morning, Captain Cook ordered Lieutenants Pickersgill and Edgecombe to set out with a group of sailors to explore the interior of the island in order to find out, if possible, whether there were areas that were more cultivated and more densely populated. Mr. Wales, Hodges, Dr. Sparman, and Georg also joined the expedition, bringing the total detachment to 27 men. Georg's father, however, went ashore after breakfast with Captain Cook and a few other officers, where they encountered around 200 inhabitants, among them 14 or 15 women and a few children. It was impossible for them to determine the reason for this imbalance between the sexes. Since all the women they had seen so far had been very generous in their displays of affection, Georg at the time suspected that the married women, who likely made up the majority, had no interest in making their acquaintance, or perhaps had been forced to remain in more remote parts of the island due to the jealousy of the men. The few they did see here and there were the most wanton creatures they had ever encountered. They seemed utterly devoid of shame or modesty, and the sailors behaved as if they had never heard of such things before, for the shadow of the great stone statues already seemed to them a sufficient shield for their excesses. Mr. Patton, Lieutenant Clerk, and Georg set out from the coast where the gathering had been largest and walked farther inland. The sun was unbearably harsh, its rays reflected from the bare, rocky ground in all directions, and not a single tree was in sight to offer them shade. Georg's companions had brought their birding guns, hoping to find some birds along the way. But their hope proved vain, and it seemed there was no other landfowl on the entire island besides the ordinary chickens, which were tame and, moreover, very scarce. They followed a footpath laid out by the inhabitants until they came upon a cultivated field planted with potatoes, yams, arum roots, and a type of nightshade. The latter is used on Tahiti and the neighboring islands as a wound remedy, and perhaps it could also be cultivated in Europe for the same purpose. The grass that normally grew everywhere on cultivated ground had been carefully removed here, and instead of manure, they had laid a covering across the entire field, perhaps also to protect the roots and plants from the scorching rays of the sun. This suggested that the natives were not entirely ignorant of agriculture, but worked the land with considerable effort and diligence. Not far from these fields they found 2 small huts, even smaller than those previously described. The entrance was concealed with a large amount of brushwood, and at first they thought they heard women's voices coming from inside. But as they listened more closely, they heard nothing to confirm their suspicion. They continued on to a hill covered with scrub. It was an acacia, but it grew barely 8 feet high and offered little shade. They rested there for a while and then made their way to other fields, cultivated in the same manner as the previous ones. These fields, however, had no fences or enclosures, contrary to what had been claimed in other travel accounts. It was likely that such details had been imagined. The steadily increasing heat of the day wore them down, and they still had a long way to go before reaching the sea. Fortunately, they came across a man who was gathering potatoes from a field. They complained of their thirst, and the friendly old man immediately ran off to a large sugarcane plantation and returned with an armful of the finest and juiciest stalks to refresh them. They thanked him with a small gift, took the sugarcane, and carved it into walking sticks. Along the way they peeled it and drank the juice, which proved to be immensely refreshing. Upon their return to the landing site, they found Captain Cook still engaged in trade with the islanders. The locals brought him chickens that had already been prepared, along with several woven baskets filled with sweet potatoes. At times, however, they tricked him by placing stones at the bottom of the baskets and covering them with just a few potatoes on top. Among the trade items, the most valuable to the islanders were empty coconut shells, which Cook had acquired on the Society and Friendly Islands. These held value only if they had a small opening or a lid. Next in value were Tahitian and European cloths, whose worth was mainly determined by size. Iron goods were valued the least here. Most of the people trading with them would immediately run off with the exchanged goods, coconut shells or nails, as soon as the transaction was completed. They likely feared they would regret the deal if they didn't leave right away. Some were even bold enough to run off with the agreed-upon items before handing over their own part of the trade. This clearly showed the pitiful condition of these destitute people. There was a great lack of clothing among them. Out of necessity, most of them went about naked, and yet they still traded their few scraps of fabric for pieces from Tahiti. Their desire to own even a small piece of this cloth led them to give up belongings they probably would not have parted with otherwise. These included their various hats and head coverings, their necklaces and earrings, and small human figures carved from narrow pieces of wood, measuring roughly 20 to 60 centimeters in length, or 8 to 24 inches. These figures were carved more finely and with better proportions than one would have expected, considering the rough workmanship of their massive stone statues. They depicted figures of both sexes. The facial features of the carvings were not particularly pleasant, and the overall shape was usually too elongated, yet there was still something distinctive in them, something that suggested a certain sense of artistic taste. The wood they were made from was finely polished, dense, and dark brown in color, similar to the wood of the casuarina tree. Since this tree had not yet been found on the island, they awaited the return of the exploration party all the more eagerly, hoping they might have made some more precise discoveries in this regard. Mahane took great pleasure in these wooden carvings, as they were much better crafted than the itais made in his homeland. He even bought several of them, assuring that such figures would be highly valued in Tahiti. As he spent much effort searching for such rare items, he one day discovered a carved female hand made of yellow wood, roughly life-sized. The fingers of the hand were bent upward in the way dancers in Tahiti traditionally hold them. The fingernails were very long, extending more than 3/4 of an inch beyond the tips of the fingers, which is nearly 2 centimeters. It was made from the rare, fragrant Tahitian wood often used to perfume oil. This type of wood had not been found on Easter Island either, nor had they seen anyone there wearing long fingernails. They could not understand how such a finely crafted object had come to be here. Mahine later gave it to Georg's father, who placed it in the British Museum. Mahine also made an effort to collect as many feathered hats as possible. He was especially fond of those made from frigate bird feathers because this bird is rare in Tahiti and its glossy black plumage is highly prized there. While Captain Cook was still in the bay, trading also took place near the watering place where sweet potatoes were being exchanged. Driven by their desire for foreign goods, some of the islanders were tempted into betraying their own people. Right next to the spring lay a field of sweet potatoes, and a crowd of people, both young and old, bustled about, digging them up and selling them. This trade had been going on for several hours when another islander arrived, drove them off in great anger, and continued alone to dig up the potatoes. He was the true owner of the field, and the others had stolen from him, taking the opportunity to sell goods that were not theirs. Without doubt, thefts of this kind also occurred in the Society Islands, for the inhabitants often spoke of them being punished by death, although they had never actually seen such a sentence carried out. On Easter Island, however, the crime went completely unpunished. This was likely due to a difference in the level of cultural development between the two peoples, even though they were otherwise so closely related. At midday, they returned on board and ate a few chickens with potatoes, which, after their exhausting walk, tasted particularly delicious. On the ship, they encountered several islanders who had dared to swim from the shore, even though it was still nearly 3/4 of a kilometer away, that is, about half a mile. They seemed astonished at everything they saw, and each one of them measured the length of the ship from one end to the other with outstretched arms. To a people whose canoes were patched together from small pieces, such a quantity of timber and of such size must have appeared incomprehensible. The desire to acquire something had even made one woman bold enough to swim out to the ship. She first visited a few of the petty officers, then turned to the sailors, and her desires were more relentless than those of a Messalina.
With the term Messalina, Georg Forster refers to the Roman Empress Valeria Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius. In antiquity, she was portrayed as the embodiment of excessive sexual desire and moral corruption. When Forster writes that the woman was more lustful than a Messalina, he is using a comparison that would have instantly created a vivid image for its educated readers. He meant an extreme, almost proverbial lustfulness. Forster's choice reflects the education of his time. Readers in the 18th century, especially within the educated bourgeoisie, had typically received a classical education. They were familiar with figures from Roman history and mythology through Latin lessons and widely read histories. Terms like Messalina served as a common shorthand for sexual excess, much as pop cultural references do today. Forster could therefore rely on his audience to understand the allusion without further explanation. At the same time, the comparison gave his description a moralizing tone, framing the scene not only as an observation but also as an interpretation rooted in classical tradition.
A few rags of English cloth and some pieces of Tahitian fabric were all she received for her services. She was picked up in the patched-up canoe, which seemed to be the only one on the island. The day before, another woman had also swum out to the ship and had been just as wanton as the first. Georg truly did not know what astonished him more: their success with the sick and half-starved sailors, or their relentless lewdness. In the afternoon they went ashore again, and Georg visited the hills to the south, which were very easy to climb due to their extremely gentle slope. He came upon a large banana plantation, and farther up, some ruins of a collapsed wall on which perhaps a statue had once stood. From there he walked across a few fields and met a family that was in the process of digging up their potatoes. He approached their hut, which was the smallest he had ever seen. As he drew closer, the people gathered around him, and he sat down among them. There were about 6 or 7 people, including a woman and 2 small boys. They offered him some of their sugarcane, and in return he gave them a small piece of Tahitian cloth, which they immediately wrapped around their heads. They were by far not as curious as the people of the Society Islands, and soon returned to their work, which Georg had interrupted. Some wore feathered hats, which they offered to trade for a piece of cloth the size of a handkerchief. Next to the hut, he saw a few chickens, the only ones he had so far encountered alive on the island. Their behavior toward him was entirely peaceful, in keeping with the general character of the South Sea peoples. According to the accounts of Roggevein's voyagers, it almost seems as if the Dutch had fired upon these poor people merely for amusement, though they had done them no harm. A large number of them may simply have wished to frighten the others by shooting some of the islanders. It is quite possible that the fear of the deadly European musket, perhaps reinforced by the visit of the Spaniards, had once again awakened in them at Georg's arrival, causing them to behave with such timidity and caution. Yet it also cannot be denied that their character shows everywhere something gentle, compassionate, and kind-hearted, which makes them so compliant toward strangers and as hospitable as their barren land allows. Georg then returned by the same path and went back on board with Captain Cook. At 9 o'clock they reached the shore and fired one of their muskets as a signal that they needed a boat. Their pinnace was sent at once, and thus the detachment returned to the ship. Georg's father, worn out more than the others due to his long-suffered rheumatic pains, had to go straight to bed. The other gentlemen, however, joined them for supper, during which they ate a few chickens that had already been prepared and purchased ashore. They spoke about their activities, and since it may be more convenient to hear it as a continuous narrative, here is an excerpt from Georg's father's journal.
As soon as we had landed, we went directly inland, following the base of the highest mountain, which lay in the south, until we reached the other side of the island. Around 100 of the islanders, including 4 or 5 women, accompanied us on this walk and sold us a large quantity of potatoes and some chickens, which somewhat replenished our food supplies. A middle-aged man, covered in tattoos and with his face painted white, walked ahead of us, holding up a white cloth on a small stick, which served as a signal to his countrymen to step aside. The ground was covered everywhere with stones of various sizes, porous, sponge-like and black, brown or reddish in color, clear evidence of volcanic fire. The footpaths had been cleared of stones to some extent, but were so narrow that we had to walk with our feet placed one directly in front of the other. This walking style came naturally to the islanders, who were used to it, but was unfamiliar and tiring for us Europeans. We often stumbled and lost our balance in the process. On either side of the path, the ground was covered with a thin layer of evergreen grass known as paspalum. It grew in small tufts and was so slippery that we could barely walk on it. On the eastern side of the island, we came across a row of stone statues, 7 in total, 4 of which were still standing upright. However, one of the pillars had already lost its top. They all stood on a platform, similar to those on the other side of the island, and the stones in the pedestals were worked in the same way in both places and fitted well together. Although the stone from which these statues were made seemed rather soft, since it consisted of red tuff covering the whole island, it is still difficult to understand how a people without tools and other mechanical aids could shape and erect such massive figures. The general name of this eastern row was Hanga Tebao. The word Hanga was prefixed to the name of all these rows of statues. The individual statues were called Ko-Tomoai, Ko-Tomoai, Kohu'u, Morahina, Umariwa, Winabu, and Winape. We walked north along the coast and passed a deep ravine on our right. The ground for a long stretch consisted of the same iron-rich tuff from which the statues were made, and was covered with small fragments of stone. Shortly after, we reached a place made of a single, solid, continuous rock or black molten lava, which seemed to contain some iron. There was no soil, grass, or plants to be found there. We continued through various fields of bananas, potatoes, yams, and arum roots. The grass that grew here and there between the stones had been dried and spread over the land, either to protect it from the sun and keep it moist, or to serve as fertilizer. Wherever we went, boiled potatoes were offered to us for sale, and at one hut where we stopped, we were sold some fish. Some of the islanders were armed, but their weapons consisted only of the previously mentioned sticks, tipped with a piece of black, glass-like lava, carefully wrapped in small pieces of cloth. Only one man had a battle-axe, shorter than those of the New Zealanders, but otherwise very similar. On each side of the axe, a head was carved, and pieces of the same black glass were set in place of eyes. They also had some roughly carved wooden figures of human shape. though we could not learn their use or meaning. We did not believe, however, that our ignorance justified us in calling them idols, as is often done with the art of unknown nations. We left this hut and went further north, but found nothing new. From a few nearby houses, a man and a woman came toward us, each carrying a large bag made of finely woven mats, filled with warm potatoes. They stood at the side of the path we had to walk. As we approached, the man gave each of us some of his potatoes, and after distributing many from his pile, he ran with great speed to the front of our group to share out the rest until all were given away. In return for my portion, I gave him a large piece of cloth, which was the only gift I offered to reward his generosity, something I had not even seen in Tahiti. Soon after, the people told us that their eri, or hariki, their king, was coming to meet us. Some men went before him and gave each of us a piece of sugarcane as a sign of friendship, saying the word hio, which in their language means friend. Shortly afterward, we saw the king standing on a hill and made our way up to him. Mr. Pickersgill and I presented him with some gifts. We asked for his name. He told us he was called Ko-Tomoai, but immediately added that he was eri. We asked further if he was only the ruler of a certain district or the chief of the whole island. At this, he stretched out both arms as if to embrace the entire island and said, "Waihu." To show him that we understood, we placed our hands on his chest, called him by his name, and added the title King of Waihu. He seemed very pleased with this, and conversed at length with his subjects. He was of middle age and rather tall. His face and body were decorated with dots. His clothing consisted of a piece of mulberry bark cloth, stitched with grass and dyed yellow with turmeric. On his head he wore a diadem made of long, glossy black feathers. Yet we did not notice that the people showed him any particular reverence. Indeed, in so poor a country, he could not have claimed great privileges without clearly violating the natural rights of man, which might have had dangerous consequences. When we wished to continue, he seemed somewhat displeased. He asked us to turn back and offered to accompany us. However, since our officer was determined to go on, he accepted it and went along with us. We approached a hill, and when we reached the top, we stopped to take some provisions. Afterwards, we waited so that Mr. Hodges could copy some monuments. At one of these monuments, we found a complete human skeleton. A more detailed description of some of these monuments can be found in Captain Cook's account of this voyage. Our men sat down on the ground and laid out their stock of bartered food before them, while the officers and other members of our company engaged in various conversations with the islanders. One of the sailors, who was carrying my plant bag along with some nails it contained, did not pay enough attention. One of the islanders seized the opportunity, took it, and ran off. No one noticed except Lieutenant Edgecombe, who immediately fired his musket, loaded with small shot, after the thief, throwing us all into some agitation. The native, feeling that he was wounded, quickly threw the bag down, and our men recovered it. The poor fellow soon fell to the ground himself. His countrymen carried him away for a time, until we signalled for them to return, which nearly all of them did. Although this was the only incident during our stay in which the inhabitants of this island were fired upon, it is still regrettable that Europeans so often assume a right to punish people who are entirely unacquainted with their laws. From here we went further inland and came to a deep well, which seemed to have been cut by artificial means and contained good, fresh water, though somewhat turbid. We all drank from it as we were very thirsty, and went on, passing some large statues that had been thrown down. From this spot we saw the two hills where, on the 12th of this month, we had noticed most of the statues from the ship. Nearby was a rise from which we could see the sea on both sides of the island, stretching far beyond a plain that had also caught our eye from on board. We could survey the entire eastern coast and its numerous statues at once, and we were convinced that on this side of the island there was neither a bay nor a harbour to be found. With this discovery, we returned and came to a large statue called Mangototo by the islanders. In its shade we had our midday meal. Close by we found another, even larger statue, which had been overthrown. It was 27 feet long and 9 feet in diameter, surpassing in size all those we had yet seen. On our way back we stopped once more at the well to quench our thirst, which had been greatly inflamed by the fierce heat of the sun, whose rays ceaselessly reflected from the bare rocks. From there we went toward the mountains that ran across the island, but the path was rougher and more difficult than ever. The ground was everywhere covered with volcanic cinders and barren for long stretches, although there were traces here and there that it had once been cultivated. Here I felt how much I had been weakened by the long-lasting rheumatism. All my limbs were, so to speak, withered. I could scarcely keep up with the others, though at other times and generally I did not tire so easily. The people of the island had stayed behind, seeing that we were taking such a difficult route. Only one man and a small boy remained with us. As our officers and their party had missed the nearest path back to the ship, I separated from them and took with Dr. Sparman, a sailor, and the two islanders the nearest way, which the latter showed us. The old man saw how weak I was. He offered me his hand and walked beside me on the loose stones at the edge of the path, bringing me forward with great skill much more easily for a long distance. The small boy ran ahead to clear the stones that lay in the way. After many repeated pauses, we at last reached the top of a mountain, from which we saw the western sea and our ship anchored upon it. The mountain was overgrown with mimosas, here 9 to 10 feet high. Some stems were dense, and at the root as thick as a man's thigh. On the way, we also came upon a spring. The water, however, had a foul taste and smelled of sulphur, yet we drank from it. The sun was now already setting, so that we spent nearly 2 hours descending the mountain in darkness, during which the help of my islander was doubly valuable to me. I waited for Mr. Pickersgill and his command, for I was almost 5 kilometers ahead of them. We had covered at least 40 kilometers on the most difficult paths, without finding a single tree to shelter us from the burning sun. To my kind guide I gave, as a reward, all the Tahitian cloth and the entire stock of nails I had with me, and at last I happily rejoined the whole command on board.
This message shows that even the most meticulous research has not sufficed to shed clear light on the remarkable objects they encountered on this island, especially regarding the gigantic monuments which are so frequently found here and yet seem far beyond the capabilities of the current inhabitants. One must assume that they are remnants of earlier, more prosperous times. According to their most precise calculations, the population of the entire island could never have exceeded 700 people, and these few spend nearly every moment of their lives merely securing the most basic necessities to survive in their miserable condition. They lack tools, they don't even have adequate shelter or the most essential clothing. Hunger and deprivation haunt them too severely for them to even consider the creation of such statues, whose completion would have taken an entire lifetime and whose erection would have required the combined strength of the whole population. During their journey, they saw not a single tool that could have been used for sculpture or construction, nor did they find any new quarries or unfinished statues that could be attributed to the present-day inhabitants. It is therefore most likely that the population was once far greater, wealthier, and happier than it is today, and that they at least had enough time to flatter the vanity of their rulers by building monuments. The traces of ancient plantations they found here and there on the mountain tops support this assumption. Besides, it is difficult to determine by what accidents this people has declined so drastically in both number and prosperity. Various causes might be named for this collapse. One cause that would fully suffice to bring about 100-fold misery on a population confined to such a small space is the devastation that a volcano can cause. Who knows whether this island was originally created by a volcano? After all the rock types found here are of volcanic origin. Likewise, the island could have been devastated again by more recent volcanic eruptions. All the trees and plants, all the domesticated animals, even a large portion of the inhabitants could have been destroyed in such a terrible upheaval. In this way, hunger and misery would tragically become relentless pursuers of those who survived the earthquake. The small carved human figures they previously mentioned and the hand of a dancer discovered by Morahina also remain unexplained, since they are made from a type of wood that no longer exists on the island. The only explanation that came to mind was this: that they were made in a much earlier era and survived the general catastrophe associated with this island either by accident or through deliberate care. All the women they saw in different parts of the island did not number more than 30 in total, even though their men had traversed nearly the entire island from end to end, without finding the slightest indication that more might be hidden away in some remote district. If there were really only 30 or 40 women in comparison to 600 or 700 men, then the whole nation must soon die out, or everything previously assumed about a majority of men, polyandry, must be incorrect. Most of the women they encountered did not seem to be accustomed to one single man. Rather, they appeared to align more closely with the spirit of Messalina or Cleopatra. Even so, this unfortunate imbalance between the sexes is such a peculiar phenomenon that they did not consider it fully understood or properly explained. They would have been ready to accept any argument against their theory, no matter how problematic. Though none of their groups had found a secluded valley where the remaining women might have hidden during their stay, they did need to mention the caves they previously described, into which the locals never allowed them access. The Icelandic caves are spacious enough to hold several thousand people. It is very likely that similar caves in a land just as volcanic could be large enough to shelter several hundred individuals. They could not understand why the people of Easter Island would be more jealous of their women than the Tahitians, but they were well aware of how promiscuous and open seafaring peoples tend to be. especially when they enjoy such superiority over the natives as the Dutch and Spanish must have had over the inhabitants of Easter Island. The strongest objection to this hypothesis is that the number of children they saw, who would not have needed to be hidden for the same reasons as the women, was also extremely small and insignificant. They had to leave the matter unresolved. If the number of women was truly as low as they had reported, then it must have been reduced by some extraordinary and rare event. The inhabitants could surely have told them something about it, but in all their efforts and inquiries they were unable to learn anything definitive due to the lack of shared language.
This concludes episode 38 of Georg Foster's journey around the world about the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook. A map with the key locations of this episode is linked in the show notes. If you'd like to see how these places look today, visit my YouTube channel Voyage to Go, where I trace Foster's path and explore the echoes of history in the present day. Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next part of our expedition. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support my work, you'll find the PayPal link in the show notes. The journey continues, and I'd love to have you along for the next chapter, because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.